Hey everybody, it's Carissa. This is Bad at Keeping Secrets, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Joe Keohane. He's the author of The Power of Strangers. I'm going to have him tell you a little bit about himself, but I think originally we were really attracted to this book as sort of a guide to reconnect with people after coming out of the pandemic. And Joe's going to give us advice about how to connect with people, to what the value is of talking to people that we may not know, to sort of bridge the gaps, to find the things that we have in common instead of highlighting our differences. So, Joe, thank you so much for writing this book and for being willing to talk to me about this
Oh,
form of happiness that we never really take advantage of.
sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background or where you came from and how you got interested in talking to people you
Yeah.
don't know?
Yeah. I grew up in Boston. So it all sort of started with my parents because my parents are just inveterate stranger talkers. They talk to everybody all the time. They go on vacation and they come back with friends. Like even today, they're closing in on 80 and they will go on vacation and come back with friends. So I grew up watching that. It wasn't mortifying to me like it is for a lot of teenagers. It just seemed like a pretty good way to live. There were always people around. They had tons of friends, tons of contacts. You know, it was not only a really enjoyable way to live, but it makes life easier to have a lot of friends, obviously. So they were a huge influence on me. I went into journalism after college. I've worked at newspapers, magazines, websites, just worked for everybody for a long time. So my business for years was talking to strangers, but in a very structured way where everyone's roles are strictly defined, right? Like you're an interviewer, the person talking is talking, you're going to discuss something, like even if it's sort of confrontational, like you all know what the rules of the game are and you know what you're expected to do. Um, so I did a lot of that, and that got me comfortable talking to strangers, especially strangers who are from wildly different backgrounds or have things like money or power, you know. Um, and I did it on like recreationally as well. So I always found that it was very interesting just to chat with somebody. Some, big turning points in my life came as the result of just like completely random interactions with people. And so I understood, I had a pretty deep feeling of the benefits of doing this. However, this was probably 6 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago. Not to blame everything on my daughter, but in this case, I am going to blame it on her. I found that I was just withdrawing, right? So I found that I wasn't really doing it anymore. I wasn't talking to people in the rare occasion that I could actually get to a bar. I was sort of shutting down in public. I was opting for like the self checkout lines in the pharmacy, like all that stuff. I was withdrawing from the public in a way. And I just noticed it one day how strange it was that I would stop off for like a beer before picking up my daughter at daycare, and I would just stare at my phone the whole time, and I would just feel like shit. Like you would feel lousy after just like disappearing into Twitter for a half an hour. And I would look down the bar and everyone is hunched over, like looking at their phones. And so I wondered not only how did I get like this, but how did everybody get like this? And so I started, as you do in my business, just started poking around and making some inquiries and reading a little bit and making some phone calls. And as far as I could tell, two things happened that withdrew me from the public. And I didn't choose to do this. I didn't elect to not talk to people anymore. I just stopped, right? I just kind of defaulted out. And one was the fact that I had a very young kid and I was tired, right? And it takes energy to talk to strangers, for sure, because you have to be much more alert and attentive and engaged when you're talking to someone new than you do when you're talking to like a family member or a friend, as horrible as that sounds. So it was that. So it was just, didn't have like the bandwidth or the capacity to do it. But I think the bigger thing was just that I had a smartphone. And, like I love texting, I love the phone in a lot of ways. But what the phone does is for members of a certain privileged class, like you can literally go the rest of your life without talking to a stranger again, right? Like everything you need to do, you can get done with the phone. So you need directions, like for a previous generation, you would stop and ask for directions. You need to order a pizza, like you used to have to call the guy to get the pizza. Now everything can be done on the phone. And so as far as I could tell, what happened with me was I just started using the phone more and more to conduct my daily business. And as I did that, I kind of fell out of practice, right? Like I lost my social muscles, I atrophied in a way. So I think those two things conspired to sort of knock me out of the public realm. But then I just started asking around. I started to think about what I was missing. And again, some really key moments in my life came as the result of talking to people, and completely completely random interactions in strange places, and these people became like instrumental, right? Like close friends. They opened up opportunities. Like this has happened to me on a few occasions. And so I wanted to try to quantify what I was losing by withdrawing from public in this way, by not talking to people. And it sent me down, dozens of different avenues. And in the end, hopefully I can make like a relatively convincing case that it is actually really important to do this. There are a lot of challenges, there's a lot of stress involved. For some people, there is hazard involved, but I sort of make the case by the end of it by going through the history of humans' interaction with strangers and the scientific research that society happened because, or civilization happened because people learned to be comfortable with strangers, to cooperate with strangers, and to communicate with strangers.
So I kind of want to, there's a couple different points, or actually there's a huge amount of directions we can go in after that.
Oh,
A
sorry,
couple things.
sorry.
Oh no, it was great. Thank you for basically introducing you and making an argument for the book. So we can kind of get into the research. But I was in a conversation yesterday with a group of people who were like, oh, it's kind of depressing that the new goal of my life is to sit and scroll. Like I'm going through all of the motions only to get to this point where I can sit idle and scroll. And I thought, oh my God, that is really depressing. Like all of our interactions are just sort of like things that we have to do or not. I guess it's easy for me to say because I think I'm pretty open about my addiction to my phone, or I'm trying to kind of work through that. But then I guess in the beginning of your book, you talk a little bit about how loneliness is a pandemic and it can be worse on your health than smoking. And I was wondering if you could kind of talk about the state of loneliness right now and kind of the ways that it sort of interacts with our like whole body health, I guess you could say.
Yeah, it has. So it has obvious psychological ramifications. So, it can lead to depression, it can lead to heightened anxiety, it can lead to anger. There are a lot of negative psychological effects of loneliness. But what researchers have discovered over the last 10, 15 years is that there are actually really serious physical effects too. And like you said, yeah, I mean, some of the research has suggested that it's as unhealthy for us as smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. It has, it can cause hypertension, it can cause heart disease, anything, any sort of physical condition that can be caused by intense stress, loneliness causes. And the reason why is because we are by nature social creatures. And I think this is a point that's missed very frequently when people talk about humanity as a mass, as a species, is we don't give ourselves enough credit for being as social as we are. In the context of the natural world, we are remarkably social. Like it's highly unusual for members of a species to be able to walk up to a total stranger and like have a conversation without killing each other. So like our closest genetic cousins are chimpanzees and bonobos, and chimpanzees are famously xenophobic, right? Like they'll walk the perimeter of their areas like looking for strangers to fight. They're really nasty. They can be really aggressive. Good with their own groups, but and even then kind of touchy with their own groups. But so to consider the fact that it is relatively easy for us to make friends, to build our social networks, to cooperate with people we don't know, to ride the subway with 100 strangers and not attack each other. Like this is a remarkable achievement. And I feel like we should give ourselves more credit when we, especially right now, I think people are a little pessimistic about human nature. But much of that has to do with our wiring and our needs. And we have a basic chemical need to connect with other people, right? Like this is what keeps us healthy. This is what keeps us mentally well. And the reason why is because being social is the reason is the secret to our success, such as it is. We can argue about the long-term ramifications of the existence of humanity on Earth. But the reason why this species did so well and spread to cover the whole world is because it has that gift for socializing, right? And the incentives of like our evolutionary incentives reward us for doing the thing that furthered the species. And that is like socializing. So when you remove that, it's incredibly stressful to people. Loneliness is incredibly stressful. It's incredibly difficult. And there is a sort of feedback loop with it where if you're lonely, you become agitated, you become less confident about your ability to connect with other people, and then you withdraw further, and then your social skills erode even further, and it becomes harder to get back and harder to get back, and eventually you are just on your own. And people can become violent, they can become suicidal. I mean, it's a horrible thing, and it is a very widespread problem right now. Interestingly, though, the cohort, I have to remember who did it. it might have been Aetna, the insurance company, but don't quote me on that, did a really broad-based survey to try to gauge levels of loneliness in American society. And historically, the loneliest people were the oldest members of society, right? Which makes certain intuitive sense. They're not working, their families are doing other things, often they live alone. But only recently did that flip, and now the cohort that claims to be the loneliest is 18 to 22-year-olds. So that's catastrophic. If you have like a rising younger generation that's already suffering acute loneliness, that's going to lead to mental health epidemics, right? And it already is. Mental health issues are skyrocketing now. Not necessarily only because of loneliness, but researchers believe that that's one of the factors playing into it.
I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about stranger danger and the sort of like ideas that we've kind of, at least for me, been embedded in me since I was young, about the idea of the other and how it might actually not be as dangerous as we think. And I really find a lot of comfort in this, because I imagine us as humans on this like very narrow tightrope, like when we're on the subway and there's like hundreds of people around us. Like, what is this sort of like all the like social laws that we're like subconsciously abiding by at every given moment? Can you talk a little bit about maybe the bad rep of stranger danger?
Yeah. I mean, we do have to define strangers in different ways, different types of strangers. So there is like the other, which is going to be like a cultural stranger, a racial stranger, someone from a group that your group has very little interaction with. That's a different type of stranger. And that obviously speaks to a different type of issue. But stranger danger, I grew up in Boston in the 80s and 90s. And, I'd be in Catholic school and they would bring in cops, and the cops would warn you about the threat posed by literally every person in the world you haven't met, right? Like, stranger danger is everyone in the world. It's like, except for the 100 people whatever it is, everyone else poses a threat. And that message was drilled into us as kids again and again and again. There were the ads, there was like the cop visits, there was the messaging in schools, the messaging in churches. Like, that was nonstop. There is no evidence to support that level of hysteria about the threat that strangers pose to us. Ironically, and I went through all the data for the last many years to get a sense of like how much of a threat strangers were, and what percentage of major crimes are actually committed by strangers. And compared to people we know, it's a tiny percentage. So, the biggest fear is that strangers are going to abduct a child, right? And that's like the whole Centers for Missing and Exploited Children are basically founded on that perceived threat, right? And it's a good organization too, and they're good people, but that was their main concern. That is a tiny percentage of abductions are committed by strangers. All of the other ones are committed by people known to the victim. A very small percentage of murders are committed by strangers. The vast majority are committed by people known to the victim. So we see it again and again and again. If you're gonna accuse an entire cohort of being inherently violent, that cohort is the people you already know, right? Which makes sense too, because you have like time to develop beefs with them. You have time to develop stresses and like things that annoy you about them, or maybe one of you screws the other one over in a business deal, or whatever it is. There are many more reasons to kill someone you know than there is to kill a total stranger. But it was a moral panic. People just got this idea in their heads, and it was exacerbated by human psychology, because part of our psychology does make us wary of strangers. That convinced half of the world that everyone they don't know poses a threat to them. And a little bit of research now is starting to show that actually eroded an entire generation's ability to trust other people. And a lot of the glue that holds society together is trust of strangers, right? It's like the idea that people are good, people can be trusted in a general sense. And so when you keep telling children that people can't be trusted, eventually they're not going to trust people. And that kind of undermines the basis of society. And it also makes it more difficult for people to form connections, because they're so suspicious of people. They're so afraid of people that it'll be harder to make the leap of faith required to make a friend, to meet someone, to make a contact, that sort of thing. Yeah.
When I think about this too, and I don't know if you talk about this in the book, you probably do, the idea of when we have an idea, or not, it's not manifest destiny, but like when you have an idea of fear of someone, it's more likely for them to project and be that fear. I was wondering if there was any research on like our assumptions about people actually manifesting. Like, if we assume people are good, they are good. If we assume people are out to get us, that it's more likely. Can you speak on that or not at all?
Yeah. There are a couple things at play. One is just it's a phenomenon known as pessimistic bias, which is whatever happens, you're going to take the most pessimistic reading on it. And one way that can manifest is, say you believe that all Irish people are car thieves, right? And you absolutely believe this. All Irish people are thieves. They're all stealing cars.
Are you
And
Irish?
then Irish American, yeah, I was fifth generation Bostonian. But so you come to believe that that's your bias, right? And now every time an Irish person steals a car, you say it's because they're Irish, right? And then you say this just proves my point that the Irish are car thieves because this one Irish. You tend to generalize based on this negative perception you have of the group. And in that way, you're just constantly confirming your own biases by selectively like gathering evidence, right? It never occurs to you to be like 99.999% of these people aren't stealing cars. It's the one that validates the argument for you. So you certainly have that. I think, and certainly like race can really play into this too. There's a lot of research on how white people perceive young black men as older and larger than they actually are. There have been studies where they ask study participants, is this person armed? And that'll break along racial lines. So there's a lot of that sort of stuff of perceiving threat where there is no threat along racial lines. We can certainly see that. But there's a more insidious way well, not more insidious, but there is an insidious way in which this can play out, which is if you have a negative perception of strangers, right, as a category, or a group of strangers, a subset of strangers, whatever it is, you think they're bad, you think they're violent, you think they have poor willpower, poor impulse control, whatever it is, you're just not going to interact with them, right? And so when you withdraw from a population of people in that way, if you just say, I'm not going to interact with Irish people because they're all car thieves, then the fantasy you have about them is going to run rampant, right? Now you're going to imagine what they're like, and you're going to become more and more convinced because there's no real world experience that is checking the bias that you have against this group. So now you're just getting really upset about a completely imaginary group of people. We see that in politics in the US where like they'll do surveys of Democrats talking about Republicans and Republicans talking about Democrats. And they're like, Republicans think that a huge percentage of Democrats are gay. Democrats think a huge percentage of Republicans are like evangelicals. Like we don't understand each other because we don't have any interaction with each other, direct as like individuals, as equals, And so then we withdraw because we're convinced that these people are bad. And then we just keep imagining worse and worse things and imputing more negative motives to them and that sort of thing. And that just justifies our ability to withdraw further. And then some really truly nasty stuff can happen once like all contact is terminated. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I was wondering I mean, it is stressful, and as an anxious person, I definitely can feel those loops of bias. I've been definitely working on with my psychiatrist that I need to like check in with reality more frequently than I do. But I was wondering if maybe we could pivot a little bit to why maybe in our brains it feels good to talk to strangers or to meet new people.
Yeah, I mean, in one sense, it's adaptive, right? And again, it goes back to what we were talking about, where the key to humanity's success has been the ability to form these bonds, right? Not just with friends and family, but with strangers as well. And you can see there's safety in numbers. You can pool information, you can gather innovations, news, you also get like a wider pool of potential mates. Like there's lots of reasons why it's good to have the power to talk to strangers. And so, yes, so our bodies reward us, our minds reward us for doing these, for making these connections. That's why it feels good. Only in the last 15 years or so have psychologists begun to study this, which is funny because we've like cities have existed for 7,000 years, 6,000 years. People have lived a life defined by the presence of strangers for 6,000 years. And only now are we like, oh, I wonder how this works. Like there's been so little curiosity about the positive side of stranger interaction, whereas psychology for many years is focused on like us, them, right? Like the more divisive aspects of human psychology. So it's cool now that they're doing it, but what they're finding, and some of the leading psychologists on this are like Nicholas Epley at the University of Chicago, and his former student Juliana Schroeder, who's in California now, and Gillian Sandstrom, who's in London, who's the queen of this stuff now. Gillian's amazing. Is that people have an overwhelmingly negative, like people's predictions of how it will go if they talk to strangers is negative at this point. They think they'll be rejected. People will think that there's something wrong with them. People will think that they pose some sort of threat. they'll have nothing to talk about, they'll be boring, they'll be slow-witted, they'll be nervous. Like, they're overwhelmingly pessimistic about how these interactions will go. And so two major findings so far. One speaks to that, which is when these researchers send out, at this point, hundreds of people, fairly diverse groups of people, to talk to strangers, to like take the initiative on subways, in the street, wherever, and like start a conversation with someone. The threat of rejection is very low. The threat seems to be very low. People find that they're much better at it than they thought they would be. They find that they like the people a lot more than they thought they would. They find that the people are more interesting than they thought they would. And some research finds that the people who are like approached in the first place also reported liking the people who came up to them. It tends to go very well. And Epley and Schroeder did this on the CTA in Chicago on the subway, and then they did it again in London on the subway, which is bananas, because Londoners think they're like the most unfriendly people in the world, which they're not. Where there are like rules against talking to strangers, right? So like the scariest thing ever in London is to like chat up someone on the tube. And so they had like 150 people do that too. And again, overwhelmingly positive interactions people had. And they came back and they couldn't believe it, that this didn't result in murder or ostracization or institutionalization or all the things that they were worried about. And so, yeah, number one, we tend to believe it's going to go badly. Research shows that it almost always goes well. And the other thing is, there's been a lot of research on how people feel after they have these interactions. And Gillian Sandstrom's done a lot of these. And what people feel when they do this, they might be charged to go talk to a barista at Starbucks, or like talk to a fellow student, or talk to another commuter, whatever it is that after they have these interactions, and these interactions don't have to be like soul-bearing, deep conversations. They can be something as minor as just a little bit of pleasant small talk. They come away feeling calmer, more trusting, a little more optimistic. They feel more connected to their communities. They feel a stronger sense of belonging, an enhanced sense of well-being. Basically, everything that's a check against loneliness is what people experience when they have a pleasant interaction with a stranger, right? And so that's a breakthrough, and it does make evolutionary sense too, because again, we should be rewarded for doing the thing that contributes to the success of the species, which is like making those connections, reassuring people. For me, and this is something that I'm just thinking of this now, per our conversation before we started rolling, it's tremendously reassuring to talk to people, right? And it doesn't always go like fantastically well, and some people don't want to talk, and I respect that. That's great. But if you were to form your entire perception of what humanity is based on what is available on your laptop or your phone, you are going to come away with an overwhelmingly negative perception of humanity, right? So if I'm just going off Twitter, I'm going off the news, and I say this as a member of the news media, like if I just drew all my insights into humanity from the news, I would think that humanity is irredeemable, right? They're awful. And I feel that way sometimes. I feel that way fairly frequently, partly because the world is in distress, but also because I consume a lot of stuff off the internet and off the news. When I do go out, I do talk to somebody, I feel so much better, right? That it's possible to make a little connection, especially if the person's different than I am, they're from a different group, they've lived a different life. It makes, and again, this comes back to like our tendency to generalize on the basis of interactions, that when you have a couple really positive interactions with people, when they surprise you with their kindness or their wit or their storytelling ability or whatever it is, their warmth, then you feel better about humanity. So it is actually a really, in my case, and I treat it like medicine at this point. It's a really effective way to deal with hopelessness, right? So when you're stuck in your room and you just think humans are shit and you don't want anything to do with this, and you're lonely, and that's causing you to continue to withdraw from people, to go out there and just talk. You can talk about the weather. Again, it doesn't need to be like a huge existential conversation. You can just have a little chat. You can notice something, you can joke around, whatever. You do feel a lot better afterwards. You feel a little more reassured. You feel that like we have the ability to deal with some of the problems that we're facing now.
So I have a question, if you could kind of elaborate a little bit on if there's any differences between, well, what kind of small talk is and what most people consider to be small talk, and what I don't know if there's another deep talk. And then also if there's any sort of like, if it matters at all topically, in terms of creating those connections. Because I feel like a lot of people I know are like, oh, I don't like small talk, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I completely understand the difference between the two. And for me, they both have if there's a depth of curiosity in that interaction, I feel like it doesn't really matter what the or I don't know if could you talk a little bit about
Yeah.
the distinction
No,
between things?
it's a great question. It's a really important question. Small talk gets a bad rap, and justifiably, because small talk, if it's the only talk, is a nightmare, right? Like we've all been trapped in those conversations that go nowhere. But an anthropologist named, it might be Kate Fox. Her last name is definitely Fox. She's an English anthropologist. She studied small talk. And what she discovered, or theorized, was that small talk is not an end in itself. If it becomes an end in itself, then it's useless. But there is a functionality to small talk, and what it is that it functions like a bonding ritual. So we see bonding rituals in traditional societies, stuff like that. And we have our own bonding rituals, like saying hello and shaking hands and making eye contact, ways that you can open the pathway to a deeper connection with somebody, right? How you can reassure someone that you're not a threat, that you're worth talking to. And so in that sense, small talk is a way of acknowledging that you're in a room with someone, you're face to face with someone. It's a chance to demonstrate that you're not chaotic, you're not erratic, you're not violent, that you can be spoken to, that you can speak, that you can make eye contact. It's like reassuring, right? That you're around a stranger and you don't feel that this person's going to go berserk on you. That's what small talk does. It recognizes the immediate environment. That's why weather small talk, which is like the most hated form of small talk, is actually really valuable, because it shows that you're aware. You're aware of who you are, you're aware of where you are, you're aware that we're sharing something in common. And so as long as you understand what it is, it's absolutely critical, because it reassures someone that you're not a threat. And from there, you can go deeper into a conversation. But sometimes even small talk leads somewhere fun. You just have to really listen and pay attention. But that's what that's for. So if you're stuck at a party and you're just in this endless small talk loop, it's because neither of you understand what this is actually for. And once you get that in hand, then you'll develop you'll understand the way to a better conversation, a deeper conversation.
I mean, this is not really in order of of my questions, but I kind of feel like that maybe should lead us into like how to listen to strangers and how to talk to strangers, and maybe when we're allowed to talk to strangers. So
Yep.
maybe let's start off with listening, because I feel like listening is a skill that I've definitely been trying to cultivate for many, I don't know, like 20 years now. And I still,
Yeah.
I mean, maybe I'm better at it than when I started, but I don't know.
Yeah, it's a thing that a lot of people find challenging. I'm among one of those people. Is like, you know, I come from a loudmouth culture of Boston. Um, yeah, there's an argument that can be made that talking to strangers is more listening to strangers than talking to strangers. And this is what stresses a lot of people out sometimes, is that in order for a conversation to really take the form it should take, to be the best conversation it can be, it involves a little bit of vulnerability on the part of both people involved in it. And what that means is you're not going to control the conversation. So once, and I can talk about like getting people in shape to a point where they're more comfortable doing this, but the best conversations I had involved not talking about myself at all, or very little, right? You can talk about yourself a little bit, but not steering the conversation into a direction that I'm personally interested in, but listening to what the person's saying and then just asking basic journalistic questions, which are going to be how, who, where, when, how, what did you do after that? Who was that person? What did that mean to you? And then you just go along for the ride. And that is so much harder to do than you would expect, because it sounds very simple, but especially when someone feels anxious about these interactions, there is a tendency to want to control it, to like get it under control, to like tackle it, rope it, get it down on the ground. By talking about yourself, by steering it into something you want to talk about. We've all been in those conversations where someone's clearly, or we're doing it too, where someone's clearly fishing, like trying to get it to something that they're interested in. You have to stop doing that if you're going to have like really interesting conversations with people. So you need to relinquish control and then just ask basic questions, not leading questions, not questions that are designed to like insert you in the story in some way, but just like, but who's that and what happened then? And like, oh, that's amazing. That's how the magic happens, right? But we're so accustomed to controlling conversations, mainly because so many of our conversations take place on digital devices, that you can like time your response when you're texting. And again, like I love text. I'm a habitual texter. And I love it for this reason, that it's like a form of writing. But you can time it, you can wait until you're ready to write something good, you can revise it. Whereas when you're in person, this is a live fire situation and you have to be very alert and you're subject to the rhythms of the conversation and you have to follow the person. And that's when it gets really fun. And once you learn to do that, like people will I don't want to say shock because that is a negative connotation, but you'll be amazed by how different the person is than you expected them to be when you started the interaction.
So I want to pause on something a term that you brought up. I was wondering if maybe we could talk about, and again, sorry, I'm leading you.
Right.
But I was wondering if you could define what you mean when you use the term vulnerability, and then also like kind of maybe highlight the role of that in conversations that are meaningful.
Yeah. In this sense, it's mainly, the vulnerability of entering into a situation you don't know where it's going to go, right? So it's entwined with trust in a way that you've seen this person, you've talked to this person for a second, you're going to go along for the ride here, right? But you don't know where it's going to go. You don't know if like this person's going to start talking about something weird or uncomfortable. Certainly, people have had that experience commonly enough. It's kind of a form of faith. That's what I mean mainly in that sense of like the vulnerability of listening is maybe you hear something you're not super comfortable with. It doesn't necessarily have to be like something that's offensive or insulting, but maybe this person has a story or an insight that you don't agree with, right? And you have to listen, and you have to keep asking the normal questions and like resist the urge to fight, resist the urge to correct them, to offer advice, that sort of thing, and just go with it. And that can feel really vulnerable because we're not accustomed to that sort of interaction at this point.
Can you speak to like the ability to, I guess, I don't know if you feel this way, but like going into conversations with people that you know that you have differing views. And I think that for me, my training was like, oh, I'm going to go into this conversation, and I don't like to admit this out loud. And I want you to, I'm going to persuade you into changing your mind to believe what I want to believe, and how maybe that's not the most effective way to actually connect with someone.
Yeah, it's a great point. For this book, I spent a lot of time with a group called Braver Angels, which was founded by a bunch of political operatives from both sides of the aisle. And what they were doing and still are doing, and they have a pretty good membership now, is just literally teaching Democrats and Republicans to speak to one another, like teaching them to be able to sit at a table and have a conversation, not even a political conversation, like to tolerate the sight of one another and talk. And their argument, and the science backs this up, is that nothing shuts down an argument more than leading with the contentious part, right? So if you're talking to someone who is different than you on guns, you start there and you're just going to butt heads and you're not going to get anywhere because you don't trust each other and you don't know each other, right? They're just going to be like, you are one of them, and you're going to be like, you are one of them, and I'm going to bring you to my side, which never works, right? Because there's no human connection there. So what Braver Angels does, and you can apply this to any situation where you are forced to or elect to talk to someone whose views are different than you are, or whose background is different from you are in a way that might cause some unease, is small talk, right? It's just like, where are you from? What's it like there? Like, what were your parents like? Do you have a dog? Do you have kids? Sports is a big one for men particularly, but for everybody in a way. But that sort of thing, like connect. And this is the thing, is that when you don't feel embattled, when you don't feel that you're under threat or stressed out, the human mind does naturally gravitate towards seeking commonality, right? So if you feel their backs against the wall, you're not going to listen, you're ready to fight, fight or flight impulse is in full force. But when you're comfortable and you sit down, you talk about like you going on vacation this year, like that sort of thing, and you will find, and everyone has experienced this, you will center on something that you have in common. Like dogs are great. Dogs are amazing for that, because people who have dogs love dogs, and they will trust someone who has a dog, right? And then you're like, oh, what kind of dog do you have? And they get all excited. And then that just takes the heat down a little bit. And people become a little less alien to each other and a little more complicated and a little deeper and a little more, varied than they gave them credit for. Because, one of the really nasty parts of political polarization is that our perception of members of the other side becomes really simple, right? Like very, very simple. They are like one-lunged, one-dimensional creatures. So anything we can do to complicate those attitudes is really useful. And direct interaction with someone in a comfortable place where you both feel reasonably comfortable and you can find some sort of common ground that's not political, it doesn't have to be political, that's where it starts, And then once you're comfortable with each other, you don't just say like, here's why your opinion on such and such is bullshit. You say, what got you to that place? Like explain to me the evolution of your belief, right? And then you have to listen, and it's hard to listen at a time like this because you want to jump down their throat the whole time because they're saying something that you find abhorrent or whatever. You want them to give them their story and explain how their life experiences led them to this political view. And now that complicates your perception of the other side, and they'll ask you to do the same, and now they have a more complex perception of you, and now you're human to each other, right? So this is like the whole goal of Braver Angels. It's not to solve all the problems. It's not to bring everyone in line on a certain policy proposal. It's just to rehumanize people to each other. And once you do that, then little alliances can form, and people can act as agents when their friends are saying that everyone on the other side is like this. They can be like, well, actually, I met this woman in St. Louis, and she actually had an interesting take on this. It doesn't make everyone moderate. It doesn't change anyone's minds, but it makes it possible for people to work together, right? So it's like, on one hand, it's extremely ambitious and extremely modest at the same time in its goals. But a lot of what they do, and I go into this at length in the book, a lot of what they do can be applied to everybody's day-to-day lives, right?
I like that shifting the goal away from changing someone's mind, because you can't
you just can't
people,
do it.
even though for some reason I think that I can like change other people, even though history has absolutely shown that is not possible.
Yeah.
To working with each other. I really like that.
I think the goal, if enough people do this and think this way, you can bring people closer together. They'll never become the same. But if you can bring them away from like the real lunatic fringes into something a little more pragmatic, then that's a huge accomplishment.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the rules on, I think that we both might be the type of people who are the really horrible people who want to talk to the people on planes that we're sitting next to for hours, because I just think it's this like really unique situation, almost social experiment, where you get to like talk to this person that you would normally never come in contact with, and you have this sort of like prescribed duration that somehow you have to fill. And for me, I think something that I struggle with is trying to avoid silences. And so I'm like a real nightmare if you get stuck next to someone sitting next to me. But I love it. And I love talking to people, because for all of the things that we've talked about thus far, I was wondering if you could maybe speak about the rules on when we're allowed to talk to a stranger, if there are some like societal boundaries that you kind of understand that you could speak to maybe help people in turn feel comfortable in other settings okay.
Yeah, it's a great question. The biggest thing is just being aware of yourself. So as like a 6 foot tall white guy, I'm definitely aware that my situation is going to be different than other people's situations. And also that I might be perceived as a threat if I'm talking to somebody else, right? So the biggest thing is, if you're doing it, just be aware of that. Be aware of the possible negative assumptions somebody might have about you based on what you look like or who you are. And you want to make sure that people feel safe. So if you're talking to someone, you don't want to sidle up next to someone on a darkened street. You don't want to do it away from other people. You want to make sure that like maybe it's well lit, maybe there's lots of people around, maybe it's a place where people do talk, like a restaurant, a bar, a coffee shop, whatever. Like different businesses have sort of different cultures when it comes to talking to people. You could join a group. There are lots of amazing groups that get strangers together for like philosophical discussions or life discussions, things like that are really terrific and actually really fun. And you get a pretty pretty diverse group of people. But that's mainly it. Like, everyone has to feel safe. They have to feel safe when this is happening. If they feel that you're up to something, and initially a lot of people will be suspicious that you're going to try to con them or you're going to try to hurt them. So you need to very quickly reassure people that you're not a threat, right? And then mainly I'm just speaking to like my approach, because I do have to be very mindful of myself. That's really important. And there are public places. There are like, I find that, let me think, like trains, planes, those are good places to talk to people. Airports, you can talk to people. Bars, you can talk to people. Like places where people gather and they go there on purpose, right? Public places, like good public parks that have a lot of seating, that are like optimized for human interaction. Like I live in New York, and Bryant Park is amazing. Like the people who designed that are brilliant. And they did it entirely so that people would feel very calm and they could talk to each other. So look for those public places where people feel safe. I
think this is, in a way, I know the answer to this question, in that how do you make someone feel safe? Which would be the small talk.
Yeah, it's the small talk. This gets to some of the techniques that I picked up while researching this book. But there's a woman named Georgie Nightingale in London. Georgie, for one thing, has the greatest English name I've ever heard in my entire life, but is also kind of a genius with this stuff. She runs an organization called Trigger Conversations. But Georgie, her technique for like starting a conversation, right, for alleviating the wariness, and getting past the awkwardness of striking up a conversation like on the subway, right, which is a place where social norm holds that you're not supposed to talk to people on the subway. She will use what she calls a, was it a pre-frame? Basically, what she'll do is this: she'll acknowledge that she's breaking a social norm out of the gate. And so Georgie will, like, if she's interested in somebody, if she wants to ask a question or share an insight or whatever, she'll just be like, look, I know we're not supposed to talk on the subway, but can I just say, and then we'll start the conversation. And what that does is it alleviates the fear that there's something wrong with her, right? That she's up to something, that she might be chaotic, she might be dangerous, whatever it is. It shows that she's mindful, she's in control of herself. It's also kind of an audacious thing to do. It's kind of charming. But she does that a lot. It works really well. That's a way to like get to the conversation. But once you do that, once you find a place where it's comfortable, and once you start the conversation in a way that demonstrates that you can be spoken to without anyone worrying about anything, then it's just noticing stuff. Oftentimes, it can be there's a street performer you're both watching. There's something you're both experiencing at the same time. Maybe within the bounds of like social acceptability, maybe they have like a hat or a pair of sunglasses or shoes or something that you like, and you just want to ask about them. It can be pretty banal stuff. Follow your genuine curiosity. You don't want to just be like, I love your shirt, even though you don't really like the shirt. Although that can kind of work sometimes too. But when you point something out like that and you offer like a, just like a compliment or a question or something, and then you just listen to what they say, and people will answer those questions in a fairly personal way. Like you'll get a little hint of who they are by how they answer that question. Like, where'd you get those sunglasses? They might just say the store, but they might say that they were looking all over the place for these sunglasses and they found these. And you just listen for those little hints of someone talking about themselves. And then you can kind of ask questions, and you got to be a little careful. You don't want to like grill people. You don't want to be like an investigative reporter. But just like listen and kind of ask. And if you have experienced something similar to them, you can offer a little bit of yourself, and eventually you're just kind of following each other. It's like this dance that occurs once people are comfortable with each other. And then might just have a fun conversation about sunglasses, or you might end up having a really interesting conversation about something deeper than that. But it's all about like finding the right place to do it, and then having like the opener that reassures people that nothing weird is going on here.
So we only have a couple more minutes, but I wanted to ask you a little bit about cultivating curiosity in other people, for maybe that doesn't come naturally to some. And then also B, what do we owe each other in terms of having these conversations? And if someone tries to, can you talk a little bit about the sort of, again, expanding on, I think you used the word dance, what that looks like?
Yeah, there's a phenomenon that's been studied about personal disclosures, where when people like match disclosures, like the depth of personal disclosures, they will follow each other. And so when you have, like, I'm sure you've done this, Carissa, where you've had a great conversation on a plane and it ends up being like a very personal conversation, maybe something that you wouldn't even have with friends before. That's one thing, which is the stranger on a train effect, which is people do have a tendency to have very personal conversations with strangers on transit when they feel comfortable, right? Because it's just, there's no paper trail there. It's not going to follow you home. This person's just you'll never see them again, most likely. But it's also this phenomenon of disclosures. And, if you're really mindful of the way you interact with people at a party or something, you'll notice when it starts to work, when you start to have a good conversation, they'll say something personal, and then you'll say something kind of equally personal. And you can't go like super personal out of the gate, because then people are going to think that they don't want to, there's something wrong with you, right? But you give a little bit, and then the other person gives a little bit, and that goes back to vulnerability. Like, I'm offering something a little personal at risk that you're going to make fun of me, or you're going to like walk away. And then they reward that vulnerability by like being a little vulnerable themselves. And when these go really well, it's everyone kind of matching each other at the level of vulnerability. So it ends up like that's how it works. Whereas if someone is like asking you a super personal question and not giving anything back, you're going to think that something's off here. And if you say something super personal out of the gate, they're going to be like, okay, like that's it for me. I'm going to go talk to somebody else. But if you can do that dance, then you end up having really interesting conversations. You mentioned curiosity. There is research on this too that Gillian Sandstrom did, which I thought was really cool, where she sent out a bunch of college students to one group talked to strangers, one group did what they usually did, but she had one group merely notice strangers, like sit in a public place and just look at people and don't look at your phone and don't get distracted, don't daydream, just like look around and don't stare at anyone obviously, but just wonder about them, like notice what they're doing, notice what they're wearing, notice how they're talking to each other, maybe eavesdrop a little bit, whatever, but just be aware of the people around you. And what she found was that even doing that, even just expressing or even just exercising curiosity, made people feel a lot of the benefits that people got from talking to strangers, which is like they feel like they belong to the community, they feel connected, they have a sense of well-being. Because it is a form of socializing, just noticing other people, you know, like our minds, our brains and bodies reward us even for that, because that's like the precursor to social contact. So that curiosity is really important, but it's another thing that's like, it's becoming a lost art because we are just constantly distracted. So anytime people have downtime, they'll just go to the phone, and I do it too, you know, everybody does it. But if you could resist the temptation to go to the phone and just sit there and just look around and just see people, that can actually feel really good too. And that's the only way that you're really going to end up getting better at talking to people, because you have to notice stuff, right? You have to notice what they're doing. You have to overhear things. I mean, my family stayed in New York for the whole pandemic, which is obviously a horrendous year. But when the bars reopened outside, like they had the sheds, which they still kind of have around, it was completely socially open in a way. I always find New York to be pretty friendly, but in a way that I've never seen it before, where everyone talked to everyone else. Like everyone was so starved for human contact. They were like unusually keyed into each other's conversations and what each other were doing. And it was so fun. And this is before like Omicron hit, I guess, or Delta or whatever, which one it was that like shut down the summer of fun. Um, Everything was open and everyone was talking to each other, right? And it's because we just hadn't been around each other in a long time, and it felt so good to be together that everyone could barely contain themselves, and like everyone was barging in on each other's conversations, and it was riotously fun. It was super fun. But to stay in that mode, you know, to treat this like it's a scarce thing and to take advantage of it when we have it, that we're surrounded by people we could observe and think about and wonder about. And then, you know, maybe when we get comfortable, talk to them.
Oh no, I mean, thank you so much for the book. I think for me as a person who desperately wants to connect with other people, it's a lovely how-to guide on feeling comfortable, letting go of anxieties that things won't work out or you'll say the wrong thing. There's, I mean, having the research to back it up offers a huge amount of comfort. And also the act of letting go, asking I mean, everybody can remember the sort of who, what, when, where, why questions, even if you're not a journalist.
Yeah.
To go back on. I mean, it's lovely to have like a backup plan in case you need one. That's easy to remember. So thank you so much,
Yeah.
Joe, for taking the time to talk to me and doing all the research on this, and also making me excited to go out and meet more people and not feel bad about interrupting and wanting to talk to people and
That was
connect,
cool.
because I don't think I'm alone in it.
No, it's everybody feels anxious about it, especially now coming out of the pandemic. Everybody feels a little out of practice, but you try it, and I think a lot of people will be surprised by how well it goes.
Yay. Well, thank you so much, Joe. I'm going to stop the recording.